The envelope hit the glass table at 9:43 in the morning. No warning, no preamble. Kyle just slid it across like he was returning a library book that never belonged to him. Diane sat 2 chairs down, eyes on the table, clipboard in her lap with nothing written on it. And Kyle, 34 years old, blazer, no tie, the kind of easy confidence you get when you've never been the one holding the mop. Looked at me like he expected something. Tears maybe, or at least a question. I looked at the envelope, then at him, then I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. My name is Russell Brandt. I'm 54 years old. I've spent my entire career in industrial operations. The kind of work where you learn real fast that a system either holds load or it doesn't, and no amount of presentation slides fixes a stress fracture you didn't want to find. For the last 14 years, I ran the floor at Bainbridge Industrial in Cleveland, Ohio. Not managed it from behind glass. Ran it. The difference matters. That Tuesday morning, Kyle told me my position was being eliminated effective immediately as part of an operational realignment ahead of the new fiscal year. He said he appreciated my contributions. He said my final check would be processed by the following week. I took off my badge, set it on the table, stood up, and walked out. They thought that was the end, before I tell you what happened next. If this kind of story hits close to home. If you've ever been the guy who kept the floor running while someone else got the title, do me a favor and subscribe. Most people don't, but you won't want to miss where this goes. Now, let me back up. About 2 weeks before that Tuesday, I sent a routine email to Diane Marsh in HR. Nothing unusual, just confirming the bonus processing date. January 22nd, $475,000. 14 years of deferred risk, 2 near shutdowns I personally kept off the books, and 1 compliance overhaul that saved Bainbridge Industrial from a 6-figure regulatory penalty. All of it folded into 1 number. 1 date. Diane replied after hours. 1 line. We'll verify and follow up. No follow-up came. I've worked long enough to know what silence sounds like when it's intentional. It has a different weight than ordinary quiet. The Monday after I sent that email, I walked past Diane's office. She saw me. I know because her screen lit up with something. And she suddenly became very focused on her coffee mug. No nod, no hey, got your note. Just the particular stillness of a person who's been told not to engage. That week, things started shifting. A compliance review I was scheduled to lead got handed to a junior coordinator with no explanation. My name disappeared from calendar invites I'd been on for years. Kyle stopped coming down to the floor entirely. I've seen this pattern before. It's what a system looks like when someone's already decided to take it offline and they just haven't told it yet. So I went home and pulled out the black folder. I keep it in my desk under some old operations manuals. Label on the tab says RAIN. Not because I'm dramatic, but because that's what my attorney Grant Myers called it when we drafted it. This is your RAIN plan, he said. Hope you never need it. That was 2010, right after the Harmon plant situation. 40 guys walked out with nothing because they trusted the wrong people at the wrong time. I watched that happen from 60 miles away and made myself a promise. Inside the folder, Clause 14B. I negotiated it myself during the ownership transition after Bainbridge Industrial's near shutdown. The previous group had tried to roll all retention bonuses into the next fiscal year under some restructuring language. What that actually meant: delay until people quit or forget. I didn't quit. I don't forget. I had Grant draft the clause instead. Short, clean, no gray area. Termination without cause within 30 days of vesting shall trigger accelerated full bonus payout within 48 hours, with compound penalty interest accruing at $1,500 per hour for any delay past that window. Notarized. Signed by the legal department, countersigned by the CFO, and Vivian Haddad, general counsel, still in that chair today, added a comment on the final draft. Language approved, reflects retention protection intent. I kept 3 copies. Cloud drive, encrypted backup at home in the black folder. Then I put it away and went back to work for 14 years. The thing about Kyle is that I trained him, not a figure of speech. I physically walked him through the floor. His first month showed him our pressure tolerances, explained the redundancy systems, told him why we ran secondary checks on lines that were already within spec. Because the spec is what the manufacturer says it can handle, I told him. The check is what I say it can handle. After watching it run for a decade, he wrote that down, said it was a great insight. 8 months later, he slid me a termination letter across a glass table. That Sunday night, my son Ethan texted me. He works in the same office park. Different company, different floor. The message said, "Hey, heard something weird today. Call me." I called him. He'd caught two people talking in the elevator. Something about a senior ops restructuring at Bainbridge Industrial. He didn't get all of it, but he heard enough. My name. The vesting date. I thanked him and told him not to worry. Then I got in my car, drove to the parking lot of my apartment, and sat there for 45 minutes with the engine off. It was January, Cleveland cold, not the kind that makes the news, just the kind that settles into sheet metal and stays there. The parking lot was empty, except for a couple of cars near the entrance. I had the black folder on the passenger seat. I'd pulled it from my desk the Friday before. Same way you pull a wrench you hope you won't need, but pack anyway. I read Clause 14b again, not because I'd forgotten the language. More like how you check a torque spec before you put real load on a joint. Not because you doubt the numbers, but because once the weight goes on, there's no stopping to recheck. The words were exactly what they'd always been. Clean, specific, mine. I set the folder down on the seat and looked out through the windshield at nothing in particular. My ex-wife used to say, I prepared for bad outcomes the way other men prepared for retirement. Quietly, consistently, without talking about it. She meant it as a dig. Standing there in that parking lot with $475,000 on a line and a clause in my lap, I thought she wasn't wrong. I called Grant the next morning, told him what I'd heard. He said, "Get me everything in writing. Every email, every Slack message, every calendar entry, screenshots of anything that might disappear." I said I'd already started. He said he knew I would. That was the last real conversation we had until Tuesday. The week between Ethan's text and the termination meeting was the strangest week I've had in 14 years at that company. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing did, and the nothing was deliberate. I kept showing up. Did my job exactly the way I always did. Every pipeline I touched ran clean. Every compliance check came back solid. Every dashboard green across the board. I logged everything. Not just my own work, but the gaps. The meeting I wasn't invited to attend. The review that got reassigned. The Tuesday morning where Diane walked past my office twice without making eye contact either time. The Slack messages that stopped coming. The morning I walked into the break room and two junior coordinators looked up, said nothing, and walked out. They were trying to ghost me out of the building before the clock ran out. I was making a record of every step they took doing it. On Thursday of that week, I noticed something else. A quarterly audit report I'd been the lead on for 6 years. The kind of document that had my fingerprints on every page had been pulled from the shared drive and reassigned to a coordinator who'd been at Bainbridge Industrial for 14 months. No explanation in the system, just a new name in the owner field. I saved a screenshot, added it to the file. By Friday, I had 23 separate items documented. Dates, timestamps, system logs, message receipts. I wasn't building a lawsuit. I was building a record. There's a difference. A lawsuit is what you file when things go wrong. A record is what you build when you already know what's coming, and you want to make sure the other side can't rewrite it later. Tuesday came. 9:31 in the morning, Diane sent a calendar invite for 9:45. Subject line, brief check-in. 2 attendees, her and me. Location, conference room B on the 3rd floor. Not my floor, theirs, I already knew. The invite was just the paperwork. I walked in at 9:42. Kyle was already there, which told me everything about whose meeting this actually was. Diane sat with her clipboard. The junior HR associate. I couldn't name if my life depended on it, sat near the door with a closed laptop, and the expression of someone who'd been told to witness and not speak. Kyle started with the standard language. Operational realignment. Evolving business needs. My contributions were valued. The transition would be handled professionally. Final check by end of next week. He said "we" a lot. The way people do when they want to distribute responsibility for a decision that was entirely theirs. I let him finish. Didn't interrupt. Didn't ask questions. Didn't give him the thing he was waiting for, which was some kind of reaction he could manage. Confusion he could redirect. Anger he could document. Sadness he could express sympathy over. I gave him nothing. I took off my badge, set it on the table gently, the way you set down something that was never really yours to keep. Folded my hands, let the silence run about 4 seconds longer than was comfortable for anyone in that room. Then I stood up. Kyle said something vague about respecting my legacy. Diane started to speak and stopped herself. The junior associate near the door didn't move. I walked out, didn't take the elevator, went down the stairwell the way I'd gone up every morning for 14 years because the elevator was always slower than it looked. Out through the side door into the parking lot, sat in my truck for about 3 minutes. Then I called Grant. I said, Tuesday, 9:43 in the morning, termination without cause, pull the file. He said, understood, I'll send the letter this afternoon. I said one thing, he said, I know, keep it short. I put the phone down on the passenger seat. The folder was still there from Sunday night. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it said. Termination without cause within 30 days of vesting. The clock had started the moment Kyle slid that envelope across the table. $1,500 an hour, compound, no cap. They had 48 hours to pay the full $475,000 before the meter started running in ways that would require a board conversation. I drove home, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and did nothing for a while. The coffee stayed warm this time. Outside, the meter was already running. Grant's email went out at 2:17 in the afternoon Tuesday afternoon. He sent it directly to Vivian Haddad. No CCs, no shared legal inbox, no routing through HR. Just her name in the to field and a subject line that read, regarding Clause 14B, immediate attention required. Attached the full contract, the relevant section highlighted in yellow, and a 1-paragraph cover note that stated the facts without commentary. Termination executed Tuesday, January 21st, 9:43 in the morning, vesting date January 2nd. Clause 14B triggered. Payment due within 48 hours. That was it. No threats, no demands. Just the math. I wasn't in the building when it landed, but I heard later what happened. Vivian was in a finance committee meeting on the 34th floor. Someone said she read the email once, then read it again, then took her glasses off and set them on the table. Apparently, she never does that in meetings. The room noticed she knew exactly what she was observing. She had co-signed the clause herself. Her digital signature was on page 9 with a comment that read, language approved. Reflects retention protection intent. She had written those words. She couldn't claim she didn't understand them. The 48-hour clock had been running since 9:43 that morning. So had the $1,500 per hour penalty. By the time Grant's email hit her inbox, they were already 4.5 hours into it. That was nearly $7,000 in accrued interest before anyone in legal had even read the first paragraph. What I'm told happened next was not a calm, organized response. By 5 in the afternoon Tuesday, the lights were still on in the legal department. By 8 in the afternoon, there were interns on the 34th floor pulling retention files from the archive system. Contracts going back 7, 8, 10 years. Someone had the idea that maybe Clause 14B had been superseded by a later amendment, or that a signature was missing, or that the notarization had some technical defect. They were looking for a crack in the foundation. There wasn't one. I'd built that clause the way I built everything else, with the assumption that someone would eventually put real load on it and it needed to hold. Grant had reviewed it 3 times before we finalized the language. The CFO who countersigned it had his own legal team look it over. Vivian had personally approved the wording. There was no amendment, no missing signature, no defect. Just a clause that said exactly what it said. Meanwhile, someone pulled Diane's message history, and there it was, a Slack DM she'd sent me 6 weeks earlier. Your bonus is on track for January 22nd. No issues. And an email from the week prior confirming the same. Both timestamped, both logged in the system, both now sitting in the evidence file Grant had already compiled before he sent that first email. Diane hadn't done anything unusual. She just confirmed in writing what everyone already knew. But written confirmation has a different weight in a legal proceeding than a verbal one. She'd handed me a dated record of the company's own acknowledgement of my vesting schedule, and then participated in a termination meeting 22 hours before that date. By Wednesday morning, the hourly meter had been running for 20 hours. That was $30,000 in penalty interest on top of the $475,000 principal, and it was compounding. At some point Wednesday afternoon, Kyle apparently called Vivian to ask about options, whether they could renegotiate, whether there was a way to reframe the termination as something other than without cause, whether hypothetically the paperwork could be revisited. Vivian didn't take the call. What Kyle hadn't understood, what he'd never understood because he'd skimmed the executive summary the same way he skimmed everything, was that the clause didn't care about intent. It didn't care what he meant to do or how he'd characterized it in the meeting or what language HR had used in the paperwork. It cared about one thing, the timestamp on his termination letter versus the timestamp on my vesting date. Those two numbers told the whole story. Everything else was noise. He'd signed the termination letter himself. Wet ink, witnessed by Diane and the junior HR associate, logged in the system at 9:43 in the morning, January 21st. Vesting date, January 22nd. That was 22 hours and 17 minutes. The clause required 30 clear days. They were short by 29 days, 1 hour and 43 minutes. There was no version of reality where Clause 14b didn't apply. Thursday morning, someone in internal legal found the penalty subsection, the part that specified the $1,500 per hour compound rate. Not the clause itself, which everyone had already found. The subsection, the part that most executives gloss over because it looks like standard boilerplate. It wasn't. It was mine. I'd written it that way because I knew that if someone ever triggered it, they'd need to feel the weight of every hour they delayed. By Thursday afternoon, they were 47 hours in. The interest had crossed $70,000. Combined with the $475,000 principal, the total payout obligation was now sitting at $545,000 and climbing every 60 minutes. I spent Thursday at home. Made a grocery run in the morning. Fixed a leaking faucet in the bathroom that I'd been putting off for 2 months. Ate lunch at the kitchen table. My phone stayed quiet. Grant had told me not to engage with any outreach from Bainbridge Industrial directly. Anything they wanted to say went through him. At 12:47 in the afternoon, he forwarded me an email from Vivian, clinical, careful, no acknowledgement of fault. We are currently processing your payout. Please confirm bank details. Additionally, if possible, we would appreciate a brief discussion regarding confidentiality obligations. There it was. Not an apology, not an admission, just a request for bank details wrapped in a quiet ask to make this disappear. Grant replied at 10:03 in the afternoon, 8 words. All terms remain in force as originally filed. That was the whole negotiation. Friday morning, 9:16 in the morning. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Bank notification. Wire transfer received. I looked at the number, $475,000 principal, $70,500 in accrued compound interest. Total, $545,500 in the bank. I flagged it as unusual activity. I flagged it as overdue. I set the phone down, finished my coffee. The cup was warm this time. Outside, the street was doing its normal Friday morning thing. A delivery truck double-parked, someone scraping ice off a windshield. The particular gray light that Cleveland does in January, like it's conserving energy. Nothing dramatic. Just a regular morning where a company finally did what a contract told them to do 47 hours after they were supposed to do it. An hour later, a certified envelope arrived at my door. 4 pages. Release language. Non-disparagement clauses, confidentiality provisions, and a very carefully worded paragraph about closing the matter to mutual satisfaction. They wanted a signature. They wanted this folded up and put away somewhere. No one would find it. I called Grant. He said, "You don't have to sign anything," I said. "I know." I set the envelope on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl and left it there. The boardroom meeting happened the following Monday. I wasn't there, but the industry grapevine in Cleveland is shorter than people think. And Vivian has a way of making sure the right version of a story eventually gets to the right ears. 3 investor reps had already pulled out of the meeting before it started, cited external obligations. What that actually meant was they'd seen the memo that circulated Friday night. Internal compliance incident, Clause 14b review, and decided they'd rather not be in the room when the questions started. The remaining board members sat through a presentation from the internal legal team. A redacted summary projected on the wall. The title alone was its own indictment: Review of Avoidable Financial Exposure Due to Improper Acknowledgement of Executive Compensation Protections. That's what they were calling it. Not a mistake, not a wrongful termination. Exposure. The language of people trying to categorize a fire without admitting they lit it. Kyle was already seated when Vivian walked in. Blazer off, sleeves rolled. The posture of a man who decided that looking like he was ready to work might substitute for actually having done the work. It didn't. Vivian didn't sit. She stood behind his chair, carried the physical contract. Printed, highlighted, annotated in the margins in her own handwriting, and said in the clearest voice she'd apparently used all year, "Please tell me you paid him." Nobody moved. Kyle stared at the table like the question had landed somewhere he couldn't reach. She wasn't asking because she didn't know the answer. She was giving him one last opening to say it out loud. To admit that he'd signed a termination letter without reading the contract it was attached. That he'd cost the company over $500,000 because he'd treated documentation as something other people handled. She was giving him the chance to own it before the board took ownership of him. He said nothing. The silence sat there for a few seconds, then one of the board members leaned forward and said, "I want to know how many other retention clauses in our current agreements we haven't actually read." Another one said, quieter, "And how many people like him we've underestimated." The meeting was no longer about me. It was about what happens when a company hires someone to run operations, who treats the people who actually run operations as interchangeable parts. Parts don't negotiate clauses. Parts don't keep black folders labeled RAIN. Parts don't call their attorney from a parking lot on a Sunday night and say, "Pull the file." I wasn't a part. I was the guy who knew where every load-bearing wall was and the one person in that building who'd thought to put his name on them in writing. By the following quarter, Kyle Donovan's name was gone from the leadership page on Bainbridge Industrial's website. The page refreshed one morning and his photo just wasn't there anymore. No farewell announcement, no transition post, just an empty space where a headshot used to be. Diane Marsh was reassigned to a regional HR coordinator role in a different division, a lateral move that required a longer commute and came with no explanation in the company newsletter. She packed her clipboard and her coffee mug and moved to a building on the east side that nobody visited if they could help it. Vivian stayed. She always does. People who read to the end of a contract tend to outlast the people who don't. And in the following quarter's shareholder filing, buried in Appendix C under the heading Executive Compensation Review Adjustments, was a single footnote. 11 words, settlement, executed per Clause 14B, effective retroactively. No further action pending, no finger-pointing, no admission of wrongdoing. In plain language, just a quiet formal acknowledgement in black ink that the contract they ignored had teeth, that the man they walked out had collected, and that the matter was now closed. On his terms, not theirs. Here's what I want you to take from this. I didn't win because I got lucky. I didn't win because I had a great lawyer, though Grant earned every dollar I've ever paid him. I won because 14 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and bad coffee, I sat across from a CFO who wanted to roll my bonus into the next fiscal year, and I said, "No, put it in the contract. Specific language, specific consequences. Sign it." And he did, because at the time it seemed like a small ask from a guy who wasn't going anywhere. I've missed things for this job. My son's high school graduation. I was managing a deal records request that couldn't wait. Thanksgiving 2019. Compliance audit. 3-day window. No flexibility. Christmas Eve 2016. Emergency line failure. I was back on the floor by 6 in the morning. I gave this company years that don't come back. I did it without complaint, without expecting applause, without needing anyone to acknowledge that the floor ran clean because I made it run clean. But I did one thing for myself. Quietly, without telling anyone, I made sure the work was protected. Not by trust, not by goodwill. Not by the assumption that doing right by a company means they'll do right by you. By a clause. Specific. Enforceable, time-stamped, signed by everyone in the room. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when you're 40 and you think loyalty is a currency. It's not. Loyalty is what you bring. A contract is what protects it. Check your contract. Not the summary, not the highlights someone walked you through at onboarding. The actual document. Find out what it says about termination, about vesting, about what happens when someone decides your 14 years of institutional knowledge is a line item they'd like to delete before a bonus date. If there's nothing in there protecting you, that's information. And it's not too late to fix it. I called Ethan that Friday evening, told him the wire had come through. He asked how much. I told him. He went quiet for a second, then said, "So they actually paid you?" I said, "The clause paid me. I just wrote it down." He laughed a little. I did too. It was the first time I'd laughed all week, and it didn't feel like a big moment. It felt like a faucet turning back on after the pressure's been off for a while. Normal. Like it was supposed to be there. They didn't fire me. They paid me. $545,500 wired to my account on a Friday morning. Because 14 years ago I wrote one clause, kept one folder, and trusted the document more than I trusted the people. The machine ran exactly like it was supposed to run. The clause is still there, right where I left it. The men who built this company didn't build it with trust. They built it with paperwork. I just finally learned to speak the same language. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't negotiated that clause 14 years ago. If I'd just accepted the rolling bonus language like everyone else did, I'd have walked out with nothing. No leverage, no recourse, no story to tell. Just another guy who gave his best years to a company that treated him like a line item. But I did negotiate. I did keep the folder. I did call Grant on that Sunday night. And that made all the difference. The lesson is simple. Document everything, negotiate your terms, and never trust goodwill over ink. The people who win are not the ones who work the hardest. They are the ones who prepare the best. And preparation starts with reading the fine print before you sign it. I still have the black folder. It sits in my desk at home, next to the old operations manuals. The label on the tab still says RAIN. I haven't needed it since that Tuesday morning, but I keep it there as a reminder. A reminder that the best investment I ever made was not in the company. It was in myself, in my own protection, in a single clause that turned 14 years of loyalty into something enforceable. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Know your worth, put it in writing, and never assume that loyalty alone will keep you safe. The world is full of people who will smile to your face and plan your exit behind your back. The only thing that stops them is a contract they cannot ignore.